Hey folks, Tom Opre here with the Wildlife Conservation Project. We're doing another podcast here talking about wildlife conservation. And this is really a series dedicated to the people who truly are involved in wildlife and habitat conservation on a daily basis. And today we're out in the Alaskan interior, deep in the bush, fighting the Alaska state bird, the mosquito. With Nate Turner from Turner's Alaskan Adventures. And Nate and I have known each other for 20 years. I hunted brown bear down in Cold Bay, Alaska when he was working for Rich Guthrie. And we've built up a friendship over the years and kept track of each other. And it was just really special for us to have the opportunity to experience a grizzly bear hunt in the interior of Alaska with Nate. Nate's family and Nate's upbringing, I mean, he's been here in Alaska since his teenage years. Their subsistence, I don't know what the word would be. Nate, is it your subsistence hunters or your subsistence, I mean, what is the proper term for you and your family's lifestyle?
We live a subsistence way of life. That's the way we put it.
So it's a way of life. So what's fascinating for us, and the real reason why we came here, is that Nate, by virtue and definition of subsistence lifestyle, makes a living off the land. He lives off the land, and he's been able to capitalize on it in a lot of different ways in order to feed himself, his family. He's raising some kids out here in the bush. His father and his wife are out here. He's got other family members out here in the bush. And they lead a really unique lifestyle that really, in this day and age, most of Western civilization only reads about this stuff or watches some crazy thing in a movie about it that's usually probably not very accurate. I was thinking about the film with Leonardo DiCaprio, Revenant or whatever it was called. I certainly had some misgivings about how his frontier lifestyle was as far as accuracy. But, Nate, you're the real deal. You're out here, you've made this happen, you do it, you live it. I mean, tell me a little story about how you ended up in Alaska. I mean, you grew up on a dairy farm in New York, upstate New York. And now you're here in Alaska, and we're going to go into where you are and what you're doing with your life and how, some of the important things you're doing here for the state of Alaska and for wildlife. But how did it all come to be?
Tom, my life today is really the result of my father's boyhood dream. He was a logger, had a sawmill, and later had a dairy farm, a very successful dairy farm in upstate New York, in what they call the southern tier, the foothills of the Allegheny Mountains. And my earliest memories are watching my father trap in the 1970s in New York because of his passion and dream to be connected to the land and to live from the land, even in New York. He bought a hunting lodge up in the hills 10 miles from the nearest community or nearest regular road system, really, that had winter access at least. And we had a milk cow and 9 horses, and he'd hunt raccoon in the evening and trap fox in the daytime. And we lived even a subsistence lifestyle in New York State. But we were about 10 miles from the nearest neighbors, you could say, there. And that was about as far as you could get in that part of New York, at least. And it wasn't far enough for my dad. So we ended up, a few years later, he had a dairy farm, and he was in his late 40s, and he realized if he didn't really live his lifelong passion, he never would, likely. He saw an advertisement in the back of a magazine, Fur, Fish, and Game magazine, which he'd been reading his whole life, and it said trapline for sale in Alaska. He wrote the man a letter and put a deposit in with it, and it turns out that 26 people had written from all across America expressing interest in this trapline. But the man was filtering the people that he would allow to come to Alaska, in his view. It was important to him. He told my father after we came to Alaska that it was important to him that he found somebody that would take up the way of life, not just be a recreational trapper, in his view, somebody that would come and go. He wanted somebody that would, he felt an obligation to the land to find the next trapper after him that would actually become part of the land. And these type of concepts really heavily influenced us when we first came to Alaska, realizing that we were stepping in to a tradition that had pre-existed us by generations, that we were just the latest generation of it. So I was 17, my father was 48. We within 2 months of seeing that advertisement, we were on the road to Alaska. My dad believed that the farm was sold. We were in Alaska for over a year before we knew whether truly the sale had gone through. And I think we were on the road system in the interior for about 10 days. And we got dropped off on the Kantishna River. And we didn't come back to town until 10 months later, next June. And we brought all our furs in from the winter. We'd been trapping on snowshoes. It was 1989, record snow depth and cold that year, which to us, it was tough, but we just figured it's Alaska, it's supposed to be tough. We didn't realize it was abnormally tough. But we brought all our furs in June and brought them to the fur buyer, and he says, well, what'd you do that for? The market's in January. You missed it. And my dad had been reading his whole life about how the mountain men had brought their furs in with them out of the country, you know, in the springtime, and he just assumed it was still the case. So the wonder for me, one of the greatest adventures of it all was to start a new life with my father. He'd read about it his whole life, but practical experience or actually applying what he had read was completely different. You know, we looked on the map of where we were going, and the rivers are shown as blue. We assumed the water must be blue, right? It's Alaska, pristine. No, it was muddy, salty. If you found a pond, it was golden brown and didn't look like something you really wanted to drink. So our first challenge the moment we arrived was, what do we drink? And we tried the river. It was, if you let the water settle for several days, it would finally become drinkable. You'd have a layer of mud in the bottom of the river, or on the bottom of your bucket or container. We tried some of the ponds. They were pretty loaded with beaver. That didn't look real appetizing for drinking at any rate. So my dad invented a little sand, gravel, cheesecloth, t-shirt, more layers, and he made a filter that worked. And it took 3 days for the first drip to come out of it, but it was pristine, clear water, and that's what we used right off the bat. And you had to boil the water because of what they call beaver fever, and we didn't know that. We'd heard people talk about it, but we didn't really pay too much attention to it. So we got it right away, I'm sure.
So you're talking about Giardia, which I had a little after I came hunting with you in Cold Bay when I got home. Unfortunately, it was the most agonizing pain I've ever had in my gut. And of course, you couldn't even keep a teaspoon of liquids in your body. A teaspoon in was a teaspoon out in about 90 seconds. It was not a pleasant experience. So I can't imagine being in this vast wilderness, so remote, and actually having Giardia, because it's not like you can go down the road and go see a clinic or see a doctor and get penicillin, correct?
Yeah. We like to think it divides the men from the boys. Or takes the boy out of the man or something, who knows. We didn't know we had Giardia. We just knew that, oh boy, my stomach's a little off today. Oh man, I got a cramp. And and it turns out after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, your symptoms pass. And you're a carrier of Giardia, but you have no symptoms anymore. And to be quite honest, I'd rather stay that way, because I'm free to drink out of every river, every water source I find, which is actually kind of important. If you're out in the woods all the time, you're exposed to these waters that are, I guess you would say, contaminated. I don't know if it's normal or abnormal that the Giardia is there, but if you have to constantly worry about getting Giardia, it limits your freedom a little bit. So I'm sure I'm positive, and I'm glad. I'm proud to say I'm Giardia positive.
So talk to me about the subsistence lifestyle. I mean, for the folks at home, people have heard about native folks that are subsistence users of the land. Obviously, you are of European descent. I mean, you're a white guy. Really, how does that work here for you? I mean, what is really subsistence living, and specifically, how does that work in Alaska?
Alaska has a long history of different types of subsistence living. The original inhabitants were the native populations, of course. who are still on the land and mostly centered around the villages these days. The earliest forms of subsistence was roving bands of native communities or families moving from one resource-rich area to the other to make it sustainable. They couldn't stay in one spot usually, or they had to move because of seasonal variances and like the fish coming to the rivers, and perhaps the caribou were in the hills, so they had to go back and forth. The subsistence way of life that is most well known and recognized in relatively modern times has existed for a little more than 100 years, maybe 120 years, and it actually came with the European settlers that first came into the country from gold mining and prospecting. And what they brought with them was the fur market, and an incentive for people to stay in one location and develop trap lines to catch as much fur as you could in the winter to pay for your annual needs for the whole year. And the native community readily adopted it and adapted their own interactions with the land to take part in this fur market.
And if Theft says right, I mean it was so the natives could actually they could take their same pelts and trade them for goods or for money at the same rendezvous that the European trappers were doing. But you explained to me something earlier on this trip that a lot of the trappers really weren't here just to trap. They were miners and prospectors that were looking to get rich, and they were here in the wintertime, and really it's tough to mine in the wintertime. So this is an opportunity to literally make enough money to take care of their entire cost for the mining season. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And Alaska has an interesting history of that. Is a lot of people come to the country for a very specific reason, but the land takes a hold of a segment of that movement of people. There's a certain segment of that population that belongs to the land, and they don't know it until they come here. They might have come to be a prospector, or in modern times, they might be coming to work in the oil industry or anything that's based off the road system. But they found a type of freedom, and that's the history of Alaska. People seeking to be free. Some equated it with wealth in the prospecting days, the gold mining days. They wanted to be independently wealthy so they could be free. But what happened was a lot of these guys came into the country. They prospected in the summertime. They might sink a hole down through what they would call the muck, or freeze it down actually, or thaw it down with through the permafrost in the wintertime. But some of them realized, well, this isn't very productive. I'll trap for the winter, earn some money from it, and it'll grub stake me for the next year. And but what happened was they developed real trap lines, and enough to support them. And the fur market was really good in the 30s and 40s. Even during the Great Depression, trappers were doing well. They actually made a lot of money. And they caught far less fur than a modern trapper might in some cases, but the values were much higher. In fact, dollar for dollar, the prices were similar as they are today, but forget about inflation, right? Mm-hmm. The dollar is much weaker than it was in 1930. So, but yeah, they became part of the land, and the native communities probably typified the best of it in my viewpoint. They run fish wheels in the summer because Alaska was covered with a network of trail systems, largely put in by the U.S. government to deliver mail to rural mining camps and different communities. The U.S. mail carrier had a 16-dog team.
So you're talking about sled dogs.
That's right.
All winter long, they were delivering the mail on sled dogs.
Yep, and these trails are still in the country. They're mostly grown in, but there was roadhouses every 10 to 20 to 30 miles. People stayed there full time, just taking care of the travelers that came to and from the mining camps, or traveled from village to village. And that network died with the introduction of the airplane. The airplane changed Alaska forever. And a type of economy disappeared too, because all these sled dogs were everywhere. You needed to feed them fish. So the trappers would come out of the river systems in the springtime, go out to fish camp, put up salmon, thousands and thousands of salmon, and they would bale them, dry them, and then sell them for 50 cents a pound or whatever back in the day. And they would get broadcast out through the country to the roadhouses and stuff. So you had an annual cycle of trapping, fishing, trapping in the winter, fishing in the summer, and oftentimes even seasonal work in other manners. The road commission, building the railroad, or putting in the early highways in Alaska. But the woods always drew its people back, and for generations, actually. Many of the people that came to the land, not uncommon that they spent 30, 40 years living that life, and then either grew too old or died in the process of living it.
So subsistence living, I mean, as a subsistence trapper and subsistence, we kind of spell for the folks out there, what is Nate Turner's life? I mean, now as far as the subsistence side of it, you know, and with the outfitting and guiding and that subsistence lifestyle that's incorporated into that, kind of paint the picture for us. What's your daily life like? What do you do? What do you do it? Why you do it? And you know, throughout the year, what do you experience?
You know, it's easier for me to describe it in terms of seasons, because the daily life is not much different from day to day. You have to stay busy because you're unemployed, basically. You're gainfully unemployed is the way I like to think of it. You know, there's nobody going to write me a paycheck for what I've done. I'm not dissimilar from the wolf. I have to go look for my next meal. And you have to be thinking forward. How am I going to earn enough money to be able to meet my needs 6 months from now or a year from now, and replace the equipment that I'm using that gets worn every time you use it. And these days, even to think of my 4 sons, what kind of future are they going to have? Whether they join me or they choose another path in life, that I want to have a foundation that they start out not in any way feeling underprivileged. So in terms of the seasonality of my life, is we're trappers. We came to Alaska to be trappers. Because of my father's dream, he's still active now. He's 76 years old. Fran, his wife of 21 years, she met him out in the bush here on the river. She's joined us. My brother traps with us as well. We have 2 different trap lines. We have over 220 miles of trail that we've cut over the years. I spent my 20s cutting trail. That's what I did for a living. So I would have access to the country to set my traps to earn a living from it. So the trapping season is from November to mid-March, essentially. There's some seasons that vary on that a little bit longer. And we spend our days on the trail in the wintertime, moving from one trap to the next. Some of the trails are 25 miles long. It might take a couple of days to check all those traps. There's several hundred traps on that trail. And you come back to your main camp, and then you go out another trail for a couple of days and then back. And we have a sense of obligation to keep moving, to keep checking these traps as quick as we can. And but we'll do that during the winter months, and then during the springtime when the trails go soft, but the river is also dangerous. That's the time to repair our gear, broken sleds. We had dog teams for many years. We had 26 sled dogs for 15 years. That's all we used for trapping. Now we use snow machines more, mainly because of efficiency reasons. And to be honest, my children require more attention than my dogs did. They took a lot of attention.
Well, you know, it sounds like, you know, I mean, I was out here in this country with your dad and his wife, Fran, probably 10, 15 years ago, and really had a chance to see their lifestyle with the fish wheels and the amount of salmon that come up through this river system. You know, this is coming out of the Yukon River drainage, and so there's just an incredible number of fish coming up there, and that lifestyle of catching fish and drying fish. I mean, that's what you guys fed the dogs. I mean, I watched them boil water, put rice in it, and put, you know, these whole sockeye, I mean, that's chub salmon or sockeye salmon, and feeding the dogs, and that's all these dogs ate was salmon and rice, and they were beautiful dogs. Yeah. And being able to get around there, but because of those, you know, obviously we'll lead into more of what's going on in your life today, but you obviously have a lot of obligations. Back then, you didn't have a family that you have now. You got 4 strapping boys that are all growing up, and your wife, and of course you've got obligations beyond that to the people of Alaska. And so yeah, it's understandable that the snow machine is a lot easier to maintain when you can't be running a fish wheel throughout different times of the year because you can't be here all the time.
Yeah.
But once you guys get through that winter breakup and that unsafe time on the water, on the rivers and streams here, how did you guys spend your summers?
In the early years especially, I focused on, I tried to find employment in the wilderness. It's hard to do. There's no other people, basically. There was homesteading in the early years when we were in Alaska. We saw the tail end of the Alaska homesteading programs. The federal homesteads had already ended before we came. So there were scattered communities of people that were trying to meet their obligations to build a structure and to dwell in it for so much time before they could receive title to their land. And a number of them were not going to make it. And they sought outside help, somebody to come finish their projects for them. I think there was more than a few divorces that developed over trying to build a log cabin in the boggy lands of Alaska infested with mosquitoes. We saved a few marriages and built cabins.
It's bad enough for people building a house in the civilized lower 48. I can only imagine what it's like trying to build something in the permafrost with mosquito-infested boreal forests. With grizzly bears and brown bears lurking around every tree trying to get a free meal or a quick snack. So
I took that opportunity just as the generations did before me. The prospector who was busy in the summer, and I have several friends, or one of them in particular, who's prospected his whole life, but he's really been a trapper. He's run hundreds of miles of trapline on snowshoes. But if you talk with him, he says, "I'm not a trapper, I'm a prospector." But he spends most of his time trapping. But his mind is on gold. For me, it's not so dissimilar. I'm a trapper, but what do you do in the summer months? You can't trap. The animals have to have their time to build up their populations and live raise their young and stuff. And the seasons allow for that. We leave them alone and let the land regenerate and heal. But I can't just sit around and wait for the snow to come. You have to keep moving to stay alive, just like all the other animals. If you live in the woods, you have to be gainfully active somehow. So what was available to me was, I loved being in the woods. People needed help. I really was interested in building with logs. And I built some really nice places, if I don't say so myself, because I was competing against this non-existent imaginary competition that somehow might build a cabin better than me. And so I tried to perfect each one. They didn't ask for this. They just wanted a cabin. And I'm doing full scribe log structures in remote places. We started in the woods just logging. We'd select the trees and pull them out, let them dry. Then all by hand or with hand chainsaw winches and log scribes and axes and chainsaws. And I enjoyed it. I really, truly enjoyed it because I was being paid to be in the woods and filling my time. But what came along at the same time was an opportunity to be a hunting guide. Somebody that I knew was actually a neighboring trapper who was 25 air miles away. He was a hunting guide and asked me if I'd come and help and be a packer on a hunt and just to help him out. And I didn't know if I wanted to do it. I had the idea that somehow, guided hunting, I'd heard this kind of a negative undertone about how it was only trophy hunting. It was only for egos and stuff. And I thought, I don't know if I really want to be involved in that. And, but I've always had a sense of fairness or the diligence to be fair-minded. So I thought, first go try it and then see what you think. And I was surprised. It wasn't at all what I thought it was. These were people that had been dreaming of coming to the North Country just as my father had. They didn't have perhaps the courage or the desire to give up their life and make a new life, but they at least wanted to taste it or experience it for a short time. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate anybody that wants to come and experience new things and come away with a deeper understanding of how the land really works and how the animals relate to it, and even how we relate to the animals, and our place in the system.
Well, and that brings us to a really good point. I mean, in this day and age, with the technological revolution, with the internet, social media, the fact that, somebody can take a picture of something and post it on a social media platform that literally can be watched and seen by people all over the world in nanoseconds, it's certainly changed the general public's perception about things, and it's also been utilized. It's also been weaponized by people who have ulterior motives and agendas. I mean, what your lifestyle? I mean, what is? How would you want the people of New York or L.A. or Madrid or London, these people that really don't know where their food comes from, they don't know where their electricity comes from, they don't care where their waste goes as long as it's out of sight, out of mind. What would you tell those people about your lifestyle as a subsistence outfitter and guide, living off the land as a trapper? What would you tell them? Why is it important that your lifestyle continue to exist and to flourish in this land?
It's a really interesting question, because you're right. There's a great divide between the urbanized America and the old America, the rural America. I heard at the turn of the century, the previous century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, that 97% of the American populace lived on or near a farm, mostly on a farm. And by 1980 something, it was only 3%. There was a complete turnover during that century, and there was a great disconnect from the land. And what I hear now and what I see now is that it's often portrayed in the news media and movies, especially in movies, and lots of books have been written about it, that somehow man is an intruder, that we don't belong here. I think why I fell in love with the wilderness is I found that I realized that this is the real world. And it's maybe an egocentric way of looking at it, but I was made for the land and the land was made for me. I'm part of the system, and I'm not an intruder. I care about the animals that are here. I make a living harvesting animals, but I care deeply about them and their welfare, their habitat, the sustainable harvest of them is acceptable as long as the animals are respected and the land that supports them is respected. It's not what people hear, and I don't know what motivates the false narrative that's out there, but it's certainly prevalent. It's actively trying to make sure that people that live a similar life as I've been fortunate to, and many hundreds others do yet in Alaska, and in the entire Native community, who also has a deep connection to the land, even if they aren't living on it. We're all viewed somehow as being usurpers or defilers of the Mother Nature, I guess you'd say. But it's the exact opposite. We belong here. And being here gives you a different perspective on life in itself. That's what's missing is the connection. The farmers had it originally. You didn't have to be a trapper or a hunter or anything. Just a farmer. The farming life, being dependent on the changes of nature and what it provides for you and the shortcomings. Farmers live a very similar life. They teach you humility, that you're not the top dog. You don't get to rule everything. You have to take it as it comes and find a way through it. And sometimes that means you have to tighten your belt, and that's good for you. And in this modern world, very few people have to tighten their belt, at least in America. We live a very privileged, I would even say overprivileged life for most people. And I think this prosperity is destroying people.
Oh, that's a good point. And, and the fact that you're a subsistence trapper, I kind of want to get into that a little bit. There's a lot of efforts by anti-trapping, which are, efforts and groups that are also very tied closely to the anti-hunting lobby and organizations. A lot of, you see, especially in the lower 48, a lot of these voter initiatives where they're trying to get the general public to ban trapping in various states in the lower 48. Explain to the folks out there what really happens with trapping here. I mean, we talk about, we heard the term leg hold. We hear these terms about, these animals chew their legs off. Explain to people why you trap and really what happens to the animals in this process.
Explain why I trap as well. I trap. I guess it's kind of a thread that I've been skirting around here a little bit in this discussion so far, is that I need a way to support myself, and there's only a handful of ways you can do it in the wilderness in Alaska. You can move a pile of rocks and hope you get lucky and find gold. Very few have done it. But trapping provides a mechanism to support yourself. And you don't get rich from it. There's, some years you have good years and you actually have a very good profit from it, but you use that to buy more equipment or to replace old equipment. In other years, you have just enough to support yourself. We've always made enough to live from the land, but we work every day to make sure that happens. And but trapping in itself, people have the idea that it's like you said, it's oftentimes, I believe, intentionally portrayed in terms that involve the word cruel and such things. I don't know a single trapper in Alaska that wants to hurt an animal. I know not one who finds pleasure in causing pain to an animal. But I do know a lot that spend a lot of time talking about perfecting a set to make sure that you catch only the animal that you're setting the trap for, that you have the right size trap for the right animal that you're catching, because it's a skilled trade. Think about it. There's animals out here. How do you get them to put their foot right there? In all of this wilderness, how do you get an animal to put his foot right where you want him to? That takes a lot of skill. And along with that skill comes the knowledge and the training and the experience that you can set a certain size trap for a certain size animal that doesn't cause undue harm to the animal. You're not breaking bones or cutting flesh or anything like that. It holds the animal. It retains him until you come to take him out of the trap. In the North Country, there's a variant. And what I'm speaking of right now is also applicable to the lower 48. And you have 24-hour trap check laws there to make sure that you retrieve the animal from the trap so he doesn't stay there waiting for you too long. In the North, you can't do that. The animals are bigger. They're farther spread out. It is a bountiful land, but it takes a lot of real estate to come up with the same number of animals because of the harshness of the climate. And you cannot support yourself by checking all of your traps every day. Or if you did, you're not going to have very many traps set out. And it's just not going to work. But what offsets that in the North Country is it's very cold. It's very common to be 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero. And if the animal doesn't keep moving, he freezes. So that's what causes the death of most of the animals. They freeze to death. It's not nice to talk about, because it's, you've intentionally put an animal in a situation where he's going to die. But I think most people that have experience with the outdoors recognize that all animals die. We all die, human or other animals. And the mechanism of death in the wilderness is rarely gentle or kind. Most animals don't grow old, get gray whiskers, and have a heart attack in their sleep. They get slow and they get ate. Mm-hmm. And I've watched it happen many times. I've watched wolves drag down moose and make a very quick end to them sometimes a very slow end. I've seen animals dragging themselves for tens of miles across the wilderness with their back legs broken. The wilderness can be both nurturing and it can be violent. But for those on their way out, it's violent usually. Our way is actually quite humane compared to what's normally offered as a way out.
Tell me, about this area. Where are we? Where do you reside?
To keep it simple, we have two trap lines. One of them is 100 miles southwest of Fairbanks on the Kantishna River. We own the property there. That was the original trap line that we bought when we came from upstate New York. We're the third generation of trappers on this trap line. It was started in 1926 by an old timer named Fred Mucha. He sold it to another man in 1958 named Rick Riekoff, and he sold it to us in 1989. I believe over the last 90 years, there may have been a 10 or 12 year period that it hasn't been actively trapped. Maybe one of the longer continuously running trap lines in Alaska. We'd been in Alaska 3 or 4 years, and we decided that we needed to be farther away from people, even though that one's really remote. The nearest neighbors to us was 20 air miles away in either direction on the river. But they were a little concerned because we were reopening the old trails, and they wanted to also be trappers. And rather than have conflict with somebody, even though we weren't trapping anywhere near them, more as a matter of perception, my dad put the word out with the largest fur buyers here in Alaska, Joe Maddy, the Alaska Raw Fur Company. He put the word out with him and some bush pilots we knew. Where can we find the most remote place we can go to get away from everybody? And it's hard to get that information out of Alaskans. They don't make new secrets, right? The maps don't get expanded as needed. They are what they are. And once you let that knowledge out, it's no longer a remote or uninhabited place. But we did find opportunity after a year or so. I think it was our second year we started looking, and the third year we found it. We found a place where a young trapper had started a trap line on the Nowitna River on the edge of a national wildlife refuge. And we purchased his traps and his initial efforts. We paid for his initial efforts to start trails and a little tent platform that he'd built. We ended up getting a permit from the Bureau of Land Management to have a trapping camp there. We've had it over 26 years now, the permit. And we started from nothing again. We maintained the original trap line. My brother stayed there, and my father and I started the new trap line on snowshoes and with a 5-dog team. And we, over the next 10 years, cut over 120, 130 miles of trail on this trap line, which is actually very near to where we're sitting at the moment. And life interrupted. My goal was to have a 300-mile trap line. I got stalled out at 220, mostly due to children coming into my life and marriage and all good things. I don't regret the trade, but I hope to continue cutting trail eventually. I had the fortune, as I mentioned before, that a neighboring trapper who was in this area, he was 20 miles up the valley, the only other trapper anywhere near us, was a friend of ours, and he asked me if I would work with him in the guiding camps. And when that opportunity came to work with him, I found for the first time in my life a opportunity to make some real money, which to me wasn't a lot of money. But as long as I had enough to buy $1,000 a year was good money for me before, because I lived from the trap line. I didn't need money, not much. You want to buy a new axe or upgrade your rifle or something. But when I started guiding, maybe I made $10,000 or $15,000 in a year. I didn't know what to do with all that money. I was so rich. I was just like, wow. I mean, what do you do with $15,000 when you only spend $500 a year?
Yeah, it's not like you got a mortgage or got a car payment or auto insurance or this other stuff. So
I was actually ashamed of my wealth. I was quite generous with it. I mean, I gave, I always paid to the churches that I attend. When I was in town, I made sure, but I'd pay for the whole winter when I was there, only for 2 weeks in the summer, thinking, God blessed me with all this wealth. I need to give back, but I also, really from my father's example on how to avoid debt in life, I also wisely put money aside, thinking that one day maybe I would have an airplane. They were just so cool, these bush planes coming and going. And I had the desire to maybe do that one day. So I always put away most of the money that I could. But when I started guiding, I as I said, I found a way to make a living year round. And I still continued to build log homes. And I was guiding in the spring months and the fall months, coastal brown bear on the Alaska Peninsula, Dall sheep in the Arctic, working with Rich Guthrie, you mentioned before. And then in the moose camps on my own trap line, working with my neighbor. And as time went on, he passed that area on to me after 6 seasons. And I had an opportunity to apply for a concession in this National Wildlife Refuge where we're sitting now, which was really a neat deal too, because it provided me the exclusive opportunity. I was assured that I would be the only one guiding in a given area. It's actually 1 million acres of land with a couple 100 miles of river in it. That type of opportunity brings stability and sustainability to what you're doing. You're not competing with other people, so you're actually selectively harvesting only the oldest animals and taking it as the country brings it to you instead of forcing a situation because somebody else might shoot something. You know, we're so remote that even resident Alaskans rarely come to this area because it's very expensive, and it's not a high density moose area. It's a I would say medium or even low density in some ways, but we have such great distances to cover that we can cover that we make it work for us. The landscape itself for moose, as far as moose are regarded, is currently in what you would call a low density equilibrium. There's enough predators out here that they've suppressed calf survival rates that the moose can't even utilize the food that's available for them. So
they're not actually, you know, in a situation where they're over browsing or they're beyond, their populations haven't exceeded the carrying capacity. It sounds like they're considerably, 50% of carrying capacity, historically in this area. And the moose are your primary predator, prey predator species as far as your predators are targeting that, and we're here hunting, grizzly bear. Grizzly bear management, this great, huge wilderness, this vast area, millions of acres that you guys hunt here. I mean, what impact do you have in your hunting have on the grizzly bears here?
I would say it's unmeasurable. It's so insignificant to harvest. Even the moose that we harvest, I was saying that we have a low density moose area, but I have 2 million acres of land that I'm covering. And each hunter will probably cover 40 miles of river and take 1 bull moose out of that. And meanwhile, they may have found 10 or 20 bulls. What impact does that have on the land itself? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The average pack of wolves in Alaska, they say, is about 6 wolves. And in the wintertime, it's been documented that they'll eat roughly a moose a week. So this is really, truly wild country. And the beauty of it, another beauty of it, I would say, is being in a national wildlife refuge, is this land has been set aside to make sure that it would stay this way forever. There's 16 national wildlife refuges in Alaska. There's some park preserves. All of them allow for hunting. And they also protect the way of life that I've described. And I think most people, if not most, don't realize that the door is still open for people to come and live a life similar as I've done. And I think a lot of people think they have to give up something to live this life, but you really aren't giving up something. You're gaining something. You're stepping back to the way, in my view, we were meant to live. Closer family connections, closer connection to the land, a little bit slower pace, a lot of work. There's no doubt, but I don't think anybody's ever determined hard work is going to lead to someone's death. It might even prolong your life. Yeah.
Well, so the effect on hunting of grizzly bears, but having hunters, I mean, most of your hunters come from outside of Alaska, obviously, not all your hunters, your clients, your customer base. It kind of explained to us the economic impact. You talked about being only needing $500 a year as a trapper to survive, and now, of course, now you're a full-time subsistence outfitter, and you own a couple of airplanes, so now your overhead's there. You actually have a house, in the edge of town. So kind of explain to me how, the money that comes in to Alaska from your clients, how does it get spent, and who does it benefit?
Something that's important to me is, and it's come up a little bit here in our discussion, there's actually 2 classifications in Alaska. You're either a subsistence user or you're a hunting guide, right? Or a commercial user. of the land is how the government classifies it. But that isn't accurate as far as the land is concerned and the people that live on the land. Subsistence is depending upon the resources in a given region that you live for your livelihood. I've made my entire livelihood since I was 17 years old from the harvest of wildlife and timber and berries and the produce of our gardens. That's subsistence. And the fact that someone comes into the country and pays me, and at times it's quite expensive to do these hunts. They pay a lot of money to come to experience the land. But as I've noted before, it's very expensive, very remote to operate out here. Essentially, everything that you bring into the area doubles in value the moment it's here. The transportation cost is usually equal to or more than the cost of the original product that you're bringing into the area. And I make it a point to hire rural Alaskans, especially Alaskans in general, but rural Alaskans are my focus to work with me guiding. We've been fortunate in a lot of ways, I'd say, that we have a lot of European hunters who cannot take the meat home with them because of international restrictions on transporting raw meat and logistics. It's very expensive. How do you get a moose back to Germany? So the meat gets left behind. A rural Alaskan gets a job guiding a hunter, and they take that meat home for their own winter. They've given up their own hunting season to do this. The money goes to all the stores. I buy locally in Fairbanks. I do some shopping online, but I try not to. I feel strongly that you should support the local communities nearest to where you are. There's a lot of fees with the government for land use fees, a tremendous amount of insurance requirements because somehow the people living in town think it's really dangerous out here, although it's far more dangerous being in town than it is in the woods. My odds are far greater of getting in a car wreck or run over by a bus than getting ate by a bear. Although buses don't actively seek you out where a bear might.
Well, and you're talking about the fact that you hire these folks that are like you. There are other subsistence trappers in a lot of instances that don't have the same overhead that somebody in the city has. These are Alaskan folks that are living off the land, and you are the value of your hunting trip. The value of that animal. I mean, of course, your clients are buying tags from the state of Alaska. They're paying you enough money so that you can pay the permit fees to the BLM and to the federal refuge system here. Of course, you're paying your own license fees to have your license as a master guide, an outfitter here, pilot's licenses. There's all these fees you have to pay, and they all go back into the hopper to help pay for the management of wildlife, to help for the administration of the rules and regulations that we have here in the state that keeps our communities stable and keeps people safe. But the key thing here is that you're talking about the guys that are working for you and the gals that are working for you, people that are like you. They live off the land, and this is a great way. And as you mentioned earlier, where do you go find a job when there's no place to get a job? You have to make your own job. So these people are able to follow in your footsteps, and because you have been successful, because you've gone out there and taken the risk to create a business and a successful business, and you've put that effort in, a lot of other people have benefited from it. Not only the people you've hired, but a lot of the people in the local communities that you work with. And that's dollars and cents that would never be there if you didn't take that initiative and have that dream, and that you'd be commended for that. I mean, that's really an important thing that you've created opportunities for people, stability in their lives, in a wholesome way that doesn't leave a negative impact on the earth.
I just, all I know is I've been blessed. The land will provide if you're willing to put the effort in, and you treat the land with respect. I have to say, along the lines of what you were saying, it sounds funny, but one of my greatest thrills at the end of the hunting season is handing a paycheck to the people working with me, because I know many of them, it's the only job they've had in 30 years. I've got guys that are in their 60s and 70 years old working with me. They started guiding in the 70s and got out of it. And they came back to help me out of respect because we're good friends and a community that we have. We all recognize that we are all in the same boat, depending on the resources of the land. And, Alaskans are oftentimes scattered throughout the bush, remote areas and stuff. Doesn't mean you don't like people. What a neat opportunity to have, to get paid to sit around a campfire with somebody and share your life stories and
sharing that with people from around the world, because most of your customer base actually comes from Europe.
It does, and mostly by accident. The first person I ever guided was a European, a German, who became one of my best friends in life. And he actually, I think in his viewpoint, he took pity on the poor kid that thought he was going to make a living, be a trapper, and being a trapper, and he went out of his way to help promote my business when I first started, and invited me to come visit him in Germany and stuff. So by going, interestingly, my own personal goal was never to be a trapper or a hunting guide. I wanted to be a journalist and travel the world. But because of my love for my father and his ability to communicate his dream to me and his challenge to me to give it a try, his dream became my life. So instead of heading towards my dream, I went away from my dream. I went deep into the wilderness. But because I did that, all these doors opened up for me to see other parts of the world and stuff too. So blessed is the only word I can find for it. You mentioned before about the economics of it, the money that comes into the state through license and tag sales and fees related to that and permit fees. That's something I actually feel really proud about, the benefit that comes from visiting hunters to Alaska is they actually pay the way for Alaskans to have well-managed wildlife in our state. Non-resident hunters typically, on average, harvest less than 10% of the game that's harvested in Alaska each year, but they pay roughly around 80% of the budget for all the wildlife management through very high fees and license costs. And they're glad to do it because they recognize that they're coming to our state, taking something that perhaps could be used by a local person. I've never heard a non-resident complain about that. And some of these lands, like this National Wildlife Refuge we're sitting on, it technically belongs to all of America. These are national conservation lands, not just only for Alaskans. So it's appropriate that they're here as well, in my view. But resident Alaskans have very cheap hunting licenses, $95 basically. You can hunt, fish, and trap all year long as the seasons and bag limits allow. Whereas for a non-resident to try to do something similar will cost them many thousands of dollars. And that's a pattern that's not uncommon throughout America. So it's not that Alaska is excessively harsh on the non-resident visitors. And foreigners pay even more than non-residents. A non-resident from lower 48 is the middle price.
Yeah, but, let's talk about that. For the folks at home, what does it cost to hunt in Alaska? You talked about the foreigners, but just here in the last year, Alaska doubled the cost of tags for non-residents. So that's anybody who lives anywhere else in the United States. And those fees went from, sheep went from $500 or $600 to $1,000, $1,200. So the grizzly bear went to $1,200. Yeah. I think black bear is $300 or something like that. So it was at 100% increase, but you're still the resident hunters here of Alaska were still paying $95 to hunt all those species, not just per tag like what we're looking at here. What do the Europeans pay to do that same sort of hunt? For their tags? There's
not a standard answer for it, but you could say 20% more would be close to being accurate. 20% more than a non-resident would. In some cases, even more than that.
So a brown bear or grizzly bear tag, it's the same tag. Someone from Germany is literally writing a check to the Alaska Fish and Game Department for $1,500 US then.
Oh yeah, and that's new money in our economy entirely. New money to the U.S. financial institution. Because if you're coming from lower 48, you're just trading state from state to state. But when a foreigner comes in, they're giving us their money basically, and they're leaving the meat behind, which is beautiful.
Yeah, the subsistence lifestyle. It comes around on all different angles. So,
but to be clear about that though, there's very few non-U.S. citizen hunters in Alaska. There's several hundreds in a year. There's not that many. So
yeah, and why don't you tell us? I mean, I have some idea of the numbers of non-resident hunters that come through here. I mean, a lot of people. There's always a lot of, I say always, but there's some discontent amongst resident hunters that we hear. I'm from Montana, and we heard about, hey, the guides and outfitters get all the great areas, or they get the great leases, or that kind of thing, and they're taking all the game. But in reality, as you mentioned earlier, the non-resident hunters pay for the bulk 80% of the actual cost of wildlife conservation at the state level here, and that's just non-resident fees, but doesn't include Pittman-Robertson excise taxes, where that money gets distributed to all of the fish and game departments in all 50 states from the excise tax on firearms, ammunition, and hunting products that we voluntarily pay. All of us do. Anytime we buy those products anywhere in the United States, that money goes into that fund. But, how many hunting guides are licensed in the state of Alaska, and how many clients come here to hunt, and how many resident hunters are there?
Ooh, good questions. I have rough figures for that. I won't.
Yeah, approximation. I'm not going to hold you to you.
Yeah,
You're not the director of the Alaska Fish and Game. So.
No, but there. I can speak to how many active guides there are. There's about 250, roughly 250 active guides per year, and that goes up and down. There's some people that just guide every other season. Some people that guide just every other season for some special hunt that they'd like to do, but active guides on an annual basis, you could say 250. There may be 350 licensed, up to 400 registered guides in Alaska. Of course, they have assistant guides working for them, but they're not allowed to contract hunters on their own. They just assist the registered or mastered guide. As far as guided hunters in the state, I think the most recent numbers I heard, and it stays around the same, is about 3,200. I think 2015, that's how many non-resident hunters, including aliens, hunted in Alaska. And about 500 non-hunting companions accompanied them on the hunts. Interestingly, there's an economic report that was done by an independent company outside of Alaska to assess the economic impacts for guiding in Alaska. Those 3,200 hunters generated over $80 million of direct and indirect economic benefit to the state of Alaska. About 50% of that money stayed in rural Alaska. And 50% of the employment that came from that money was in rural Alaska. So guiding works very closely hand in hand with the rural subsistence way of life. It has most in common with it, I think. Those are the closest allies in the view of sustainable utilization of the resources. They both depend on healthy wildlife populations for the very direct sustenance of the people participating in it. And that's something I actually feel proud about. I think if guiding is done right, it's actually a noble profession. I know that's a strong word to use, but it brings so much benefit to people at so little cost to the resource. The best scenario in my mind is actually when a subsistence hunter is the hunting guide. There's no way in the world an animal could be more fully utilized or appreciated than to have a subsistence hunter guiding a non-resident hunter for the fulfillment of their lifelong dream. Out of one animal's life, the hunter's dream is fulfilled to experience the land and perhaps have the benefit and the fortune to take home the animal they're seeking. Not always happen, doesn't always happen, but that's what the mission is. The subsistence hunter gets employment and a paycheck, and oftentimes gets a portion of, if not all of the meat. And wildlife conservation is funded at the maximum level because it's a non-resident paying the extra fees. It's a great system, and it costs very little from the landscape. Yeah.
Well, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this we're going to go ahead and wrap Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this podcast with Nate Turner from Turner's Alaskan Adventures, and we're going to have more podcasts with Nate because there's a lot to talk about here, especially working on the Wildlife Conservation Project's grizzly bear project here. We're in the Nowitna Wildlife Refuge here in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, battling these huge swarms of mosquitoes. And we don't have any black flies to worry about anytime soon, do we?
Not yet, but
Good.
they're coming.
Oh, man. All right. Well, we better get this hunt done. We want to thank everybody for listening to this. Look forward to the next podcast here from the Wildlife Conservation Project. If you want to find out or get any more information about what we're working on, just go to wildlifeconservationproject.com, or you can go to our Facebook page, Wildlife Conservation Project-TWCP, and we'd love to have you on there. Please like and share all of our posts and videos, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the trail. Thanks again.